Hi, everybody. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and it's getting to be this thing rhythmically where I sit down at a certain time of day every day, and I get out my Bible and the microphone, and we do the little thing here, and then we put it up on the internet, and then you listen, and it's just fun. I look forward to it, but we got these 2 days a week where we don't do the podcast, and, that's a good thing. That's healthy for everybody's rhythm, but it gets to be the time of day where I do the thing, and I'm like, oh, I don't get to do it today. And then it rolls back around to the time of the week where I get to. I'm like, game on. This is really fun. And it always makes me appreciative that there are people who want to sit and talk with me like this, who want to talk about this subject matter. So thanks for being awesome. Thanks for hanging out with me, even though almost surely you don't think all the same things I think about everything. I just think that makes it all the cooler that we get to spend time together like this. So very glad to be connecting here. I want to start by talking about the king and kingdom motif that is inescapable throughout the book of Matthew. The Old Testament has this language, well, it's not subtle at all. It's very pronounced language about God eventually establishing this great kingdom with a great king who sits on an eternal throne. And this kingdom is supposed to be wonderful. It's a kingdom where there's perfect justice and everything is right and the decision-making is right and the leadership is right and the king never dies. So you can ascribe all power and authority to this king because he's never going to go away, and you'll never have some jackwagon guy who comes along after him who's an idiot who now has all of the power that you gave because you liked the last person, but now someone stupid has it. There is no replacement. There is no successor. Eternal king, eternal kingdom, eternal throne, eternally right about everything. This really is the trajectory of redemption, of straightening things out, injustice, all the problems of the world. Everything gets fixed through this king and this kingdom. This is the redemptive plan. This is the promise. This is the plot and trajectory of the whole Old Testament. Well, fast forward to the New Testament, where we've been hanging out in the book of Matthew, and we see that clearly, not just Matthew, but Jesus himself, they're both suggesting that Jesus is this king, that this kingdom at the time this was written, early in the first century AD, was at hand. That we were starting to see the beginnings of this stuff, the rumblings of this change. This challenger is emerging to the immutable, unchangeable, seemingly invincible, unquestionable world system, world kingdom, with all of its disappointing values, with all of its compromises and ugliness and inequality and injustice and yuck. Well, a challenger has arisen, and it's the values of this new and beautiful kingdom with this new and beautiful king who really isn't new at all. He's been around the whole time. He's the author of existence. And so Matthew brilliantly edits his book in such a way that the words and the events and the anecdotes are all ordered in such a way that the viewer is being carried along. There are little hints that, whoa, Jesus is maybe the long-promised king who we've been waiting for. And then those hints get a little bit less subtle. And then we dig into an example and it just looks like a nice story on the surface. But you think about it, you're like, you know what? That is a claim to deity. That's a claim to monarchistic authority right there, just in the fact that Jesus, even though he's dressed like a homeless guy, even believes that he's in charge of justice and guilt and forgiveness enough to say simple words like, "Take heart, son, your sins are forgiven." So you got all these little hinty things that point to this king and kingdom reality. Then you get these really overt moments that point to a king and kingdom reality, like the Lord's Prayer, where straight up it's an oath of loyalty, an oath of fealty to a king. I want your kingdom to come. I want your will to be done. I want that to happen everywhere in every level of reality. You are in charge of forgiveness. I will imitate you in that because I want it for me. You're in charge of defeating my enemies. You're in charge of provision. I am falling face first at the feet of this king, and I want whatever you want and whatever you choose to provide for me. That is exactly how much I need, and that's cool. It's an oath of loyalty, an oath of subservience to a king. The original audience would have registered that quickly. For you and me, we got to work on that a little bit harder because we don't really do the king thing anymore. Well, one of the assumptions that automatically comes along with any kind of monarchy or system of feudalism or fealty is this idea that a representative commissioned and sent out by the king is to be treated as you would treat the king himself. Now, this isn't a stretch. People knew this, and it's clearly documented long before the time of Christ and long after the time of Christ. You've seen like the wax seals and the signet rings, like, oh, these are unique words. This comes with unique authority. This bears the mark. And you get this because you've seen it in every decent show ever that in any way depicts a monarchy or a medieval kind of setting. Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, you have these representatives of the king, a messenger, an ambassador, or in the Game of Thrones world, you have what are called Bannermen. And the Bannermen are people who take this oath of loyalty to a higher ranking lord, a regional king, or a national king, and they are obligated to come when called to arms or to service by their sovereign. They got to drop what they're doing. They got to put up their banners that represent the house of their sovereign, and they have to ride into battle ready to serve because they've taken this oath of loyalty. And if someone in that imagined universe that is based on the real one in which we live is riding under that banner, they are riding as a representative and under the authority of the one who summoned them. And if they ride out on behalf of that king, they ride out under the authority of the one who sent them. And either way, to mess with the person who's flying that banner is to risk the wrath of the king because effectively you are messing with the king. I mean, doesn't Braveheart even have a line like that? An assault on the king's soldiers is the same as an assault on the king himself. I don't think I got the line quite right, but I think I get the sniveling right. So you get the gist. And likewise, when we are in Matthew chapter 10 and we're getting to the very end of this commissioning, the whole thing is set against the backdrop of the idea that a king is doing this sending out, that the disciples, as ragtag and green as they might look to you and me, and as they might have looked to the original audience, they are still walking under the banner of the king. And Jesus is clearly of the impression that he has done enough, that history has done enough, that he should be recognized immediately as the long-awaited king. And that's why we get the kind of language that we get earlier in Matthew chapter 10 about when you go into a town, they ought to recognize you. If they greet you and treat you the way they should, then stay there, let your peace rest on the town. If they don't, shake the dust off your feet. And we get that same kingly bannerman hospitality motif playing again here at the end of the missional discourse of Matthew 10 and verse 40. Jesus says, "He who receives you receives me, and he who receives me receives the one who sent me. Anyone who receives a prophet because he's a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. And anyone who receives a righteous man because he's a righteous man will receive a righteous man's reward. And if anyone even gives a cup of cold water to one of these little ones because he's my disciple, I tell you the truth, he will certainly not lose his reward." Now we can dive deep into out of context verse snipping to reimagine what Jesus is saying about salvation here. Like if you give water to babies, you go to heaven and God likes you. But contextually, clearly, he's not laying out a case to describe the complexity of how the fallen man is reconciled to flawless God. That's better addressed in Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus talks about your righteousness having to surpass that of the Pharisees, and then clearly goes on to demonstrate that nobody's does, and then clearly goes on to demonstrate further in the Sermon on the Mount that the only way to reconcile that gap is by the gracious work of God, his forgiveness and his righteousness being put on unrighteous subjects, which then puts them in a position to become righteous subjects with the righteousness of the king imparted to them and upon them instead of their own deeds and their own lack of righteousness being upon them. He's not undoing that here with any of this language when he's talking about reward. Clearly what he's talking about is the right reception for the king's bannermen as they get sent out. What should you guys expect? Well, you should expect that they will recognize that you are representatives of the king and that they should respond accordingly. And in the same way that in Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, Braveheart, anything like that, you would expect that somebody with the king's signet ring or riding under the king's banner would be rewarded by the king when the king finds out that they got treated well, and that the opposite would be true if they were treated poorly. In the same way you would expect that, these are the expectations being laid out here. So we learn something about Jesus here, or rather we relearn something about Jesus, and that is he thinks who he is obvious. So big picture-wise, it's pretty easy to say what's going on here. Jesus is equipping his disciples with stuff that looks like the stuff he does and says, even breaking the laws of time and space. He sent them out with a message. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. They got what they need. People ought to recognize the signs and respond appropriately. So tomorrow we're going to break that question of rewards down a little bit more, as we also put a bow on the second great big speech around which the book of Matthew is structured, that being the missional discourse. And then we're on into chapter 11, having more fun with that. Hey, thanks to everybody who supports the program at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. I know I've told you a bazillion times that it means a lot, but I do that because it means a lot. And it's why we get to do this together. So you guys are awesome. I super appreciate it, and I appreciate all of you. Let's get back after it tomorrow. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.